Recognize. Umbra Walker. D01. Recognize. The Caleb G. D02.
Hello, team. Welcome to The Cave. Thanks for listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files, and welcome to episode 17. I am everyone's favorite sidekick, Caleb, and I'm here to remind you that secrets don't stay buried. Allow me to introduce Rich, who wants to remind you that escaping is not on the menu. Howard.
You're stuck here.
Thank you so much for joining us for yet another episode of Young Justice, episode 17 already. Man, we are just cruising along here. If you would like to get in touch with us, reach out on Twitter at the YJ Files. Our show email is whelmedpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, our website is crashingthemode.com.
So unfocused, it struggles with inner demons and can't fight harm while fighting itself. Harm doesn't battle his demons. Harm embraces them.
Would Harm please shut up?
With that housekeeping out of the way, I will turn it over to Rich for...
Hello, Megan.
Title of our episode, if you didn't know already from Caleb's intro, is Secrets. The release date was November 18th, 2011. The previous episode was just the week before on November 11th. Next week gets interesting. The in-episode date is October 31st. The director was Jay Oliva, and the writer was Peter David. And I don't think we've seen Peter David quite yet. If you don't know Peter David is a prolific comics and novel writer, both, who's done some of my favorite storylines in the comics, both for Marvel and DC, which is interesting because I have some pretty mixed Aster about Secrets, but we'll get into that in a bit.
This episode also features a change in our casting. A certain Mr. Rob Lowe is replaced with a Mr. Chad Lowe. I think they're related.
I think they're related too.
It is not a noticeable difference, I don't think, but because I like Rob Lowe's take on Captain Marvel so much, it really stood out to me. Mm-hmm. And we also have Mr. Kevin Michael Richardson stepping back into the saddle here. And also a return special guest, Greg Weisman, reprises his role as Snapper Carr.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah.
I keep thinking, like, is he in? Oh, yeah, I guess he is. I forgot, because there's actually, like, 3 storylines going on in this episode, so 3 parallel events.
Yeah, so we have a lot going on here. We better jump right into mission briefing and get it all straightened out.
Just in time for your next mission.
All right, our pre-credit scene. The New York Police Department are investigating the theft of an artifact called the Sword of Beowulf from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. During the police questioning of the curator, we learned that the sword is an object of great power that requires an incantation to unsheath, but only by someone who is pure of heart. The thief is still present in the room, hiding in the museum, and now that he's heard the curator recite the incantation, he's able to unsheath the sword, attack the officers. But when the curator comments about the bearer, again, needing to be pure of heart, the thief, calling himself Harm, clarifies that that restriction never said pure good.
Back in the cave, Wally, Connor, and McGann are getting ready for a Halloween party at the Happy Harbor High School. Then Zatanna and Artemis arrive in costume via Zetatube. When they see McGann working on Connor's outfit, Zatanna asks Artemis how long they've been a couple. Artemis, realizing that Zatanna is right, is upset by the revelation. Zatanna suggests a girls' night of patrol instead of the party, and Artemis takes her up on it.
Then Megan, Wally, and Connor, we skip a little forward, they arrive in Happy Harbor High School to discover that almost everyone is dressed in superhero outfits for the Halloween party. Suddenly, every phone in the room begins ringing with news reports of a supposed Martian attack. Then we cut back to the cave for our third story arc, which is Batman meeting with Robin, Aqualad, Red Tornado, and Red Arrow to discuss the mole theory. Calder is no longer really convinced that there's a mole, since they would probably have betrayed them during the fight with the Injustice League, who they still believe is the secret society behind everything that's happened so far.
Zatanna and Artemis motorcycle around New York on patrol, stopping a number of crimes as Artemis works off her frustration. They are eventually seen and attacked by Harm, who sees them as a challenge. They take a beating from Harm until they are helped by a mysterious girl who responds to them only with the word secret.
And then back in the cave, Red Arrow makes it clear that he still doesn't trust Artemis, reveals that he knows that Manhunter has only known Miss Martian for 5 months, which is interesting. Batman also comments that they can't really know how Superboy was programmed and that he could be the mole without realizing it himself. Back at the high school, the power goes out, and when Superboy scans the room with his infrared vision, he sees and hears Marvin through the walls giggling to himself about his great Martian attacks prank that he's pulling on the school.
Back in New York, the little girl leads Zatanna and Artemis to a brownstone. When Harm catches them, he's furious that they found his house, which confuses them. When they are knocked out by Harm, they see the little girl standing behind him, apparently having tricked them.
Back in the main subplot, one of the many subplots, Connor and McGann and Wally decide to turn the tables on Marvin, and they use their powers to trick him into thinking that a real Martian attack is actually happening. And Marvin accidentally admits to his classmates that it was a joke, to their chagrin.
Harm then interrogates Zatanna and Artemis, wanting to know how they found his house. The little girl then frees Zatanna, who tricks Harm, and frees Artemis. When they escape the building into the backyard, they see a simple grave with the name Greta and beloved sister. Then the little girl's spirit rises from the grave. The three face Harm, who is unsettled by Greta's ghost. He admits that Greta was the only person or thing he ever loved, so to make his heart pure, he had to kill her. He says that he has no regrets, but his uncertainty allows Greta to take away the power he had gained through sacrificing her. The final scene is Artemis noticing the magic shop across the street called Abel's House of Secrets. All of the lights from its sign are burned out except the word secret, which Artemis speculates is the last thing Greta saw. And that is the mission briefing for this episode. I think we have to jump right into feeling the Aster. There is a lot to talk about with this episode.
There really is a lot to talk about in this episode. Let's do it.
Superboy, are you alright?
I'm fine. Feeling the Aster.
I said before I had some mixed feelings about this episode. So I guess let's start with maybe the positive stuff. Like, there is so much nodded to from the comics in this episode. It's ridiculous. It's like chocked full. The Abel's House of Secrets, probably not going to be a spoiler. Some of these are going to have to go into Crashing the Mode, though. The original House of Secrets was a comic that ran from 56 to 66 and then was revived a few years later in 69 with a new host for the comic, kind of like the old Crypt Keeper and the TV show, which was also based on a comic. And the new host was Abel of the famous Cain and Abel brothers. His brother, the character of Cain, hosted a parallel comic series called The House of Mystery. House of Secrets is known for introducing a few long-standing DC characters like Swamp Thing and the villain Eclipso and some others. And then Vertigo revived the title again in the 80s when the Vertigo imprint came out, and Abel appeared in several issues of Sandman. The House of Secrets house itself was explained to be a house that exists both in Dream and on Earth or the Prime Plane, and it had a library that had all of these books in it that have never been written and all kinds of stuff. So it's awesome to see this kind of nod. It's super buried, but if you notice that it's Abel's House of Secrets at the end, then it just cracks open this supernatural kind of level of Halloween episode. I wasn't a big fan of Harm, though. He's definitely from the comics. The third person speaking thing really drove me insane. And though it echoes the comics in some way, the Harm in the comics, whose name was Billy, was an adopted brother who sacrificed Greta because of her innocence. So why this Harm needed or wanted the power in the episode, we don't know, or why he would sacrifice who we're told is his real sister, whom he appeared to actually love. There's not a lot of motivation behind this character on a bunch of fronts, so he just wasn't my favorite.
I agree. I did not like Harm as a character. I feel like he came out of nowhere into the series. He's really just a villain of the week to facilitate a lot of this adventure.
There's a lot of stuff to like about how they made callbacks. Like Peter David made callbacks to a bunch of stuff from the comics, but it really doesn't feed into the bigger story very much. There's a little bit of character development for Artemis and a push forward and that kind of thing, but really it's pretty unplugged.
And that, I think, is what makes it stand out the most, because for the past episodes, we've seen such a tight narrative. And even when there are weird elements we didn't expect, they always relate back in a very neat way. And
Yeah,
Harm
yeah.
is just thrown in here so randomly. And this is it. We don't see him again.
Nope, and we don't see Greta or Secret again. And I'll talk more about who Secret and Greta are in Crashing the Mode, I think, because it could be brought back again in the future series, so we'll see.
I also thought it was a little bit weird that Harm, who is presented as this third-person speaking character, which was incredibly annoying, and it was played to be annoying. I think they did it on purpose to give Artemis something to kind of grate against.
Yeah.
But there were a few moments where he broke character.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't notice, actually.
It was few and far between. The one moment that stood out to me was when they were in the kitchen, right before they blew it up. He actually reacts, quote unquote, normally, not in the Harm character. So it was an odd choice. I don't know if they were trying to imply that he wasn't as strong a character as he thought he was, if they were trying to demonstrate the weakness in his character before they brought in the ghost and started to break him down. That could be what it's implied there. It was just weird. It was just weird. And we've had so many great episodes up to this point. We're coming off the heels of some absolutely fantastic episodes. And then there's this one. It's like it pumps the brakes. Really weird. It's a little bit boring. It's all these little side things. The thing that's most important to the main meta plot is that quick conversation in the cave while all these other shenanigans are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Halloween episode with the kids at the high school was kind of cute. There were a couple of references, right? So Wally says, are you going as My Favorite Martian, which My Favorite Martian was a TV show from the 50s. And then, of course, the Marvin the Martian, which was kind of hilarious. It was cute, and there were like lots of great nods. Like, I see you got the same note that I do, which is that Mal is dressed as the original clone Superboy from the 90s, which was awesome. I love his line of, "This is Superboy if he did it right," or whatever.
I love that version of Superboy so much. And seeing Mal, who is at this point a throwaway background character, just stepping into this superhero role that I personally love is so cool.
Yeah.
That immediately just made me smile because I knew that reference.
Right.
But then later, knowing some of the things that Mal does in the later part of the series, it's just a nice nod to what he will become.
Yeah, I agree. I know it was, again, a little throwaway thing, but it's actually some of my favorite stuff in this episode, not surprisingly, was Zatanna. I love how when they're running and she's got like heels on and she's like, "Yeah, not with the heels, thanks." And she literally casts a spell that says "practical footwear now" is the spell. And of course, like the whole point of the episode, it seemed like the only thing to move things forward was for Artemis to say like secrets don't stay buried. But Zatanna says it in a really weird way. She says it's better to bring them into the light. If you're paying attention and we're talking about who potentially this mole could be and all that kind of stuff, I think it was a little too obscure for the first viewing, but after a second viewing, you already know who the mole is. So
I think it's also a fun thing to point out here in this episode that both Zatanna and Artemis had different costumes.
Oh, Artemis's outfit was freaking awesome. I don't have that much of an issue with her other outfit. It's fine. It's a little bit with the open belly thing, and people have made some comments which I think are perfectly valid about why you would do that. She's literally made comments that made her a more, I don't know, physical character, we'll say, than, say, McGann. So I can see her literally making a fashion choice of like, I want to have this as whatever. But having said that, it's kind of garbagey excuses. That outfit, her motorcycle outfit, is freaking awesome, and I kind of wish we'd had that outfit for the rest of the series.
One of the tropes of both cartoons in general and specifically comic book cartoons, we always tend to see characters in the same exact clothing.
Yeah.
Always. So a little mix up in what we expect is nice.
Yeah.
Especially because when we mostly see these characters, they are always in their superhero costumes. And we know that those are always the same.
Yeah, I think it's one of the extra reasons why I love like their Arctic outfits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of stuff, right? The stealth outfits and all that. I agree with you. I think it just feeds right into that same thing.
Now, here's something We may have to push back into Crashing the Mode. I'm not sure, but I want to bring up this question. It puzzled me during watching this episode. Every time I've watched it, you actually highlighted it in our outline for our mission briefing. When Artemis and Zatanna first get to the cave, and there's that little exchange between Connor and McGann, Artemis gets upset.
Yeah.
And I can't figure out why.
Oh, well, I don't think it's Crashing the Mode, really, because it refers back to other episodes. When Artemis first joins the team, she's out with McGann. She's watching the perimeter when they're trying to protect Dr. Roquette, and she's like, that boy. And she's talking about Superboy. In that episode, it seems more like she's just kind of being jerky about it. But then in a later episode, Artemis and McGann are actually trying to verbally redirect each other towards somebody that's not Superboy. Like, oh, you know who'd make a good couple? You and Wally. You're so full of life, and he's so... And Artemis says, full of it. So we do get some nods to it, but she's really upset. Like, almost... too upset. For some reason, I don't feel like I was really that convinced that she was into Superboy. She just thought he was like handsome or cute or whatever, and that's fine and no big deal and flirty and blah, blah, blah. But this was like, she was super upset. And I don't think that, like you're leading to here, I don't think there's a lot of setup for how upset she is in this episode. I don't think it feels proportional.
Yeah, it almost feels like it was one of those plot moments that had to happen to get the story moving.
Yeah.
And it could have been done in any other way. It could have been, we saw the other guys getting ready for the Halloween party, and Zatanna comes in and she's like, oh, well, I don't really know anybody. I'm not in school. I'm not invited. So she's bummed out. And Artemis says, well, hey, let's go out. Let's just you and me. Totally different way to handle it.
It's doing things with intention, and they're really, really good about that in Young Justice for the most part. But it's definitely something that I notice all the time about, like, the female character's plot movement or plot instigation tends to be around a relationship about a boy. And it happens so much that it just jumps out at me. And it makes sense if we're talking about, like, the relationship ups and downs that happen later in the season and later in the series in general, because we believe that these characters care about each other and it's important. But this one felt cheap. She's not that into Superboy to be this upset, which means there could have been, like you said, other reasons. And since the main point was, secrets don't stay buried, Zatanna telling her, please talk to me and let me be a friend to you and I care about you. That's the point. The point isn't Superboy. The point is that. So why even make that be an instigation? I don't know. That's my opinion anyway.
Yeah, like many things in Young Justice that Rich and I point out as not being our favorite, they're very minor. And we typically only look at them because the rest of the show is at such a high standard.
Right. And the thing is, Peter David is an amazing writer. I think he's an amazing writer. He's written incredible stuff. But I think maybe something like this is pretty par for the course for the era of comics in which he was writing. And I can only imagine, I don't know how this works. And we're getting, hopefully, here's a little something, we're getting some of the writers on the show, which is fantastic. They've showed some interest in coming on the show, and we're trying to get those organized. But I would like to try to understand and grasp how you get a bunch of different writers and directors all writing and directing a show that's not really episodic, right? Now, Peter David's used to writing episodic stuff, and he does it really, really well. But what feedback does Greg and Brandon have sitting in the room with them saying, look, this is what we need in this episode, right? Like Failsafe. This is what we need in this episode is horrible, horrible things to happen to them. And here's the general idea we have. Or do they give them specific outlines? Do they give Nicole a specific outline or like a general outline or let her know what's going to happen in the next episode, which again was written by somebody else. So all the Black Canary therapy session stuff was all written by a different person who didn't write Failsafe. So I'm not sure how the behind the scenes goes with this. I mean, Peter David is such a big writer in the industry that it's possible maybe just Greg and Brandon gave him some ideas and let him run with it. But I don't know. Like I said, there's a ton more stuff that we'll get into in Crashing the Mode about that he pulled from the comics, so he knows what he's talking about.
And the one final comment that I wanted to make, I just realized needs to be saved for Crashing the Mode also. So let's wrap up this segment and move on to Canary Debrief.
Stick around. Class is in session.
Yeah, Canary Debrief. I think this is the first time I have to say this. There isn't that much to take away from this episode about writing. I feel a little bad. I don't know. It's fun. It's got some interesting, if pretty arcane, nods to the comics. It's kind of a standalone episode in the series. Unlike Happy Harbor, though, which also felt like a weird kind of bump on the road, it was written more tightly and directed with a tighter hand. But there isn't really much. The only thing I can comment on is just the simple idea that Robin almost outs Artemis in that conversation with everybody in the room with Batman. It feeds back to what I was talking about introducing an idea a couple or 3-4 times before you make a big reveal about what that thing is, right? And in this particular case, we know that later on, Robin makes a comment. It's not really a spoiler because he kind of said it in this episode. He makes a comment, "Oh, I've known who Artemis is and everything about her history. I'm a detective." Right? And again, it could have been a throwaway line, similar to Superboy's line. Well, that is a spoiler, so I won't get into that. But Robin says that specifically. Well, I didn't notice that he had said that in this particular episode. Like, he was like, oh, yeah, well, of course, her parents are, and Batman stops him. So if you're going to have a big reveal at the end, make sure that it doesn't feel like, again, that Deus Ex Machina, that I'm pulling it out at the end because I don't have any other better ideas, or I don't have a way to write myself out of this corner. Once you realize you need something at the end of your story, go back and do another edit and put clues and bits and pieces in there for the writer early on. That's all I've got for the Canary Debrief this week. Next week, I'll have a lot more.
Well, something else I think we could say about this, we very frequently bring up role-playing games and tabletop gaming. And we could look at this episode in the light of being a tabletop gamer as a GM. This is something that happens when the party gets split.
You're right. I was thinking it feels like 2 players showed up for the game that week, and they had a little side adventure that kind of moved a little bit of plot forward, and then everybody else had an email conversation about the mole. That's what it feels like to me.
So I think what we can say here, and we've talked about this in depth on previous episodes as well as other shows that Rich and I either have been guests on or host as well. Sometimes you do have to split the party, and sometimes as a GM you do have to split your attention between multiple storylines. And that's a challenge, and it's very tough to do, and you have to know when to say, all right, we're going to pause here and go to the next story. All right, we're going to pause here and go back to this story, kind of reading the beats of the adventure and bringing characters to that exciting, what's going to happen next? Oh, geez, we're changing over to the other 2 guys now. So if you look at this episode like that, there are some good pieces of advice you can pull out for when to appropriately break a scene or pause a scene and go to another scene.
That's true. And Caleb, as you guys know, is also the co-host of the RPG Academy Network's many podcasts. And on Tribality.com, I wrote something about splitting the party as well, talking about not being afraid to do it and different techniques and ways to do it. And I think you're right. I mean, it does change scenes on beats that feel appropriate. It just also felt like we were watching 3 stories that were really incongruent with each other. What I would expect from Young Justice is 3 storylines that felt incongruent at first, and then when they got to the end of the episode, realizing they were paralleling itself in some freakish way that we didn't realize the first 3 times we watched it. Like something a little deeper. And I've watched this episode a lot. It's not my favorite, but I watched it a lot, and I'm not finding it.
Well, the last thing I think we could take from this, along those same lines of a tabletop game, sometimes sessions don't go the way you want.
That's fair.
And what matters is that you recover in the next session. And if I can speak to the future, the next session of this Young Justice game is killer.
It's very good, for sure. They hit the ground running. And it's not like it's a train wreck episode. It just sticks out as episodic.
Right, absolutely.
And villain of the week. Yeah, for sure. All right, let's get on to Crashing the Mode, because there's definitely some fascinating things going on in the background here.
Tell us something we don't know yet.
Sorry, BB. We can't risk altering the time stream. We do that, we're all feeling the mode.
As usual, in our Crashing the Mode section, we will be discussing spoilers specifically for Young Justice, but also the DC Universe in general. If you are watching Young Justice for the first time and do not want to be spoiled, please stop listening and join us later. If you are still here, you're in for it, because here we go.
Yeah, so as I started doing some research for this episode, I didn't think I was going to find much outside of the House of Mystery, but turns out I was wrong. So the character of Artemis was apparently first cast to be Arrowette. And Arrowette is a character, the most recent version, I should say, is Sissy King-Jones, who in her first appearance in the comics are the Young Justice, regular DC Comics Young Justice number 4, and she fights Harm in her first go and is stabbed in the arm with one of her own arrows, etc., etc. The thing is that there's a future episode, the Insecurity episode, that has Black Spider coming back, and Black Spider is stopped in an assassination attempt of a reporter. You remember that, by Green Arrow and Artemis?
Yeah.
So, according to Peter David, who also wrote that episode, on his blog he said that the target of the assassination was the journalist Burnell Jones, who is the father in the comics of Sissy King-Jones. So that means that that little girl in the window that saw Artemis save her dad was Sissy King-Jones, who grows up to become Arrowette in Young Justice. And she's not even, like, given credits. So there's no name in the credits, but Peter David said, yeah, that's who that's intended to be. Which, again, means that we're getting some of these younger people that we're seeing in these previous seasons. If they do keep moving ahead in the timeline, 3, 4, 5 years in the timeline, Sissy King-Jones, she was maybe 10 in that episode, right? And that was in, gosh, was that season 1?
Yeah.
It was in season 1. So that means that she's jumped ahead 5 years. So she's probably more like 13 or 14, which means now she's around the age of some of the Young Justice characters. If they jump another year or something in season 3, she could be 15, and suddenly we've now got Arrowette on the team, which I think is fascinating to me.
Or she could at least be training.
Yep.
Or possibly Artemis could be a mentor to her.
Yep. Because also now Artemis is switching over and becoming Tigress, which means that there's a spot open for the quota of archers in the team.
Because just like a good D&D game, you have to have one of every class.
Right. That's right. And speaking of potential future members, the character of Secret was also a member of Young Justice in the comics, including a time when she gave into the darkness inside herself and allied herself with Darkseid. So that could be interesting if she ends up coming back. But yeah, she was rescued from the Department of Extranormal Affairs or something like that they have in the DC Comics. I can't even remember, DEA, by, I think, Tim Drake in the comics. And then that's when she joined Young Justice and they found out about her background, and that's when Harm came in and that kind of thing. So I don't know. I think she's kind of a cool character. I liked her character. I didn't care for Harm.
The point I mentioned earlier that I wanted to bring up revolves around the conversation that was happening in the cave while all these other shenanigans were going on. At one point, Calder says the mole is not anyone on the team.
Yeah.
He's right.
He's absolutely right.
Now, the mole just happens to be in that conversation,
right.
But no one knows that
The mole
yet.
happens to be in the room with them.
I just think that was a nice nod to the fact that when the writers were creating this meta plot, they made what I think is a smart choice to not make the mole one of the primary team members.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think that was a good call.
So I very much like the fact that Calder, in his wisdom and leadership, is expressing what we know later to be the truth.
Yeah, exactly. And it also inadvertently shows, no, Calder's smart. He's put pieces together. He knows what's going on. He knows it's not a member of the team, or believes it's not a member of the team, I should say. Anyway, they've already shown that it wasn't Red Tornado. Well, I know Greg Weisman is a big fan of Shakespeare, and he's folded it into Gargoyles. He's folded it into the second season of Spectacular Spider-Man, and he folds it in here all the time. And there's definitely this Roy being, methinks he does protest too much, right? And the idea that he's being the traitor, pointing fingers at everybody else to keep the fingers from pointing away from him. And the fact that, I don't know, I feel like I'm a pretty detailed watcher, and it just never occurred to me until we got to the very end, and it blew my mind.
Yeah, that surprise is one of the best of the series, let alone season 1. And the threads are buried very well.
Absolutely.
I think one of the biggest hint toward it is the Broken Arrow line, which I never, ever, ever noticed until you brought it up when we were talking about it.
Yeah.
It's something that they did not give away, and the hints that they provided were subtle enough to keep viewers entertained and guessing while the story was playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? Another thing, kind of backing up a little to the Canary Debrief, just the idea that I've said before, don't put characters in that you don't need. And I think Peter David thought he needed to use every character on the show. And I think there's nothing really that we gain very much from Wally and Connor and McGann being at the party except for some comedy relief. And I think this whole episode could have focused more tightly on Harm and Greta and explaining a little more about why he cared or wanted this power, why he was maybe hopefully a little bit more than just evil for evil's sake and having some completely inexplicable origin. And then back and forth between the conversation to get breaks in the intensity, go back and forth with conversations between the characters that mattered about the mole. And we could have not seen them. We could have gotten a comic book, one of the comics showing them at their Halloween party and showing that little comic relief bit, like they did with a lot of the other stuff. Like, oh, Robin's not here this week. I wonder where he is. Well, go read the comics because they're going to tell you where he was, right? So I think they really could have just removed that whole one of these three subplots, and it would have given more room for some explanation, I think.
I agree with you there. I've come to that conclusion with a lot of movies, a lot of forms of media. There's scenes that I've looked at them and said, why was this 20 minutes of screen time?
Right.
Why did this happen? Right. We could have been doing something so much better with that.
Like I said before, you want us to ask questions. Oh, Robin knows who it is and he's not worried about who Artemis's parents are? That's interesting. That's a good question. The question should never be, why the heck am I watching this?
We already touched on Robin's comments and the fact that he kind of almost let things slip in that conversation. Yeah. Do you want to touch on that any further here?
It echoes back to the later on, what I was saying earlier was Superboy saying, oh, I've known about your secret, McGann, since we touched mines in Bialya. And where I thought, oh, that's cute. Okay, I guess that makes sense. They did touch mines, so I guess, yeah, I'm sure he probably saw something. But then when you go back and rewatch it and you're like, oh, crap, I saw it too. I just didn't understand the context. He was getting the emotional and telepathic context for that image that we weren't, and that's okay, right? That means that they thought ahead and planned these things 20 episodes ahead of time. It's the same thing with this, where Robin at the end, he's like, yeah, I knew who your parents were. You're not them. It's okay. Puts agency in the characters themselves. Somebody on the team knew and somebody on the team didn't care. If she had only just revealed who she was to the team, it doesn't give the team a chance to recover from that revelation. And to have other characters turn to Robin and go, oh, you knew? And yeah, you know what? Robin's right. Robin's had a chance to know and process it and ground with it and have a really good, mature response. And the other team has that to ground on. Same with Superboy. They're all horrified, except Superboy, by McGann's form. But Superboy is fine and grounded and knows and understands, and it helps the rest of the team do that as well. So few writers of episodic television care to do any of that. It frustrates me. I don't need something to have a meta plot all the way through every show that I'm watching. But if you're going to write something that seems to have a bigger picture, if you're going to pretend like you're writing a series that takes place in a living world, then you really should put some thought into what's your point. What's your point of the show besides we want to do a kitschy show about Gotham Police Department without Batman? You need to really think about what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, why you're putting characters in, why you're leaving characters out. Do you need Bruce? Do you not need Bruce? What are you doing, and who's the hero of the show, right? Same thing with Supergirl. It's gotten better, I understand, and that's great. But the early episodes, it just seemed like they didn't quite have a grasp of what they were doing. I try not to get negative on the show. I know that these shows are beloved by a lot of people. I don't happen to care for them because I don't feel like the same thought process went through from before they even started the first episode.
Well, before we head off on another ranting tangent and have to walk around the room throwing silverware.
We meaning me?
Hey, you mentioned Gotham, and I've got some thoughts about Gotham.
Okay, we'll jump off that boat quick.
Yes, let us consider this mode crashed and move on to some fan service for this week. Rich, what do you have for us?
I have a bit of a revelation. So there have been a lot of attempts at doing fan films for, 10 plus years when computer CGI graphics and that kind of thing have gotten better and better. There is multiple attempts as well of doing Dick Grayson / Nightwing series. A really great one, which I will mention real quickly, only ended up getting one episode, which is unfortunate, but it was called Grayson Earth 1, I think is what it was called. You should go find that one. It basically is a speculative piece as to what would have happened if Bruce hadn't been there that night when Dick Grayson's parents died, and who would he grow up to become. And it's a really interesting piece, and I wish it had gotten some more episodes. Having said that, the one that's the focus of our fan service today is called Nightwing the Series. It's a 5-episode series. I will have the link in the show notes. It's done by a group of people called Isma Hawk, I want to say. They also have a podcast, which I've listened to bits and pieces of, which is pretty great. They've got brilliant costuming. The acting is really solid for a fan series. The cinematography is really good. The fight scenes are shockingly good. There's a lot of little surprises and callbacks. I really, really enjoyed it. Now, this Dick Grayson's take is definitely the comic take, which is Dick Grayson and Bruce have issues, and that's why he leaves to become Nightwing. And that's okay, because that's the basic comic take on it. And that only Young Justice really has been playing with the idea that they didn't have a big fight, that kind of thing. So this Dick Grayson's a little grumpy in the beginning, a little grumpier than I like at the beginning. But he does grow into it and kind of realizes what's going on and kind of grows. So I highly recommend you checking it out. It's called Nightwing the Series. We'll have a link in the show notes.
Wonderful. And if you are a creator of any sort of Young Justice or DC fan art or fan product, please get a hold of us. We would love to talk with you and feature you here on Whelmed. If you in the audience know of any really cool videos, links, creators, pictures, songs, anything that you think we would like to share, please send it our way. We like doing these fan service episodes, and we always need more things to talk about. So with all of that being said, I think it is time to wrap up this mission and head out of the cave. As always, thank you so much for listening and spending some time with us today. Don't forget to feel the Aster.
Yeah, and we have been saying hashtag keep binging YJ on Netflix. By all means, keep doing that. But Greg Weisman has been shifting his efforts to hashtag buy YJ comics on Comixology. If you haven't picked up the comics yet, please do. They want to reboot the comics alongside the Young Justice Season 3 that we're already getting. We can do the same thing. Buy the comics, tell your friends about the comics, read them, talk about them, use the hashtag, and see if we can get some inertia behind getting more comics to parallel the show. And stay whelmed, everybody.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our computer is voiced by Madison Ray. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.